I get a chance to tell my story, there's thousands of people that don't, and it's not fair, and it's brushed under the carpet like they're not even a person. That's heartbreaking. It's disgusting.
My name is Lorraine Zimmerman. My daughter, Kelly Gordon, was a 22-year-old Boston College student who was in New York interviewing for a job. She was 4 weeks away from graduation, and she came to New York to interview at Goldman Sachs for a position. Unfortunately, that evening, coming home from dinner, she was walking home with her stepsister, and she was in the crosswalk with the light, and she walked across the street when she was struck and tragically killed. He hit her so hard that her body was flung into the northbound lanes, where a second driver who had just dropped off a passenger 2 blocks away proceeded to come and run her over after her body was thrown into those northbound lanes.
I have trouble believing that a taxi driver was driving the speed limit, would hit a young lady and knock her clear across the street. Now, we're not just talking next to the car. She was across the street on a 2-way street near me. And she was laying on the ground. The second guy, he didn't just happen upon her. I watched him coming. Is he even paying attention?
The most horrible part of revisiting that story is that the witnesses told me that when the drivers pulled their cabs over, they did stop. They proceeded to argue in the street amongst themselves over whose fault it truly was. My daughter was lying in the street, taking her last breaths. They told me she was trying to breathe, and she was grasping her throat, and there was blood everywhere, and she had, and they didn't even go over to try to help her.
Because of the context situation, they knew that they couldn't prosecute this guy, and so they really weren't all that worried about getting an exact statement from him. And I wish they had been more concerned about really getting the truth.
These 2 taxi drivers were both allowed to leave the scene of that accident. The cars were not impounded. They were not checked for safety regulations. My daughter's blood was on that taxi cab, and both drivers drove away. And they technically could have picked up another fare down the street. There was not even a summons issued for reckless driving. Absolutely nothing. Questioned and released. They killed a young 22-year-old child with an amazing potential future. And they were just allowed to drive home and pick up a fare, have dinner with their family that night. That, to me, is incomprehensible.
When you think about it, it's hard to imagine anything worse for a parent than losing their child through the negligence and recklessness of a cab driver, or through the negligence or recklessness of someone when they did not have to do what they did.
I think people assume that when you hit someone with your car, there's some sort of consequence. You go to jail for 6 months, or they do think something happens to you. And in the majority of cases, that's not true.
The district attorney's office, I couldn't understand why they wouldn't prosecute these drivers, and they kept saying it was an accident. It was not an accident. This was preventable. This was a crash. These drivers killed my daughter.
Are these accidents? I have trouble believing that there's no culpability here with these 2 drivers. And I wouldn't call it an accident.
Even if you did do it intentionally, you could just say you didn't do it intentionally, and you would pretty much be off the hook. That, in my experience, is what would happen to you.
In a city like New York, getting hit by a car that's turning into a crosswalk while you have the right of way is a leading cause of death. Kids like Cooper Stock, kids like Allison Liao, these are innocent kids doing everything right, holding their guardians' hands, getting killed by drivers that just aren't yielding. And what we've found in New York City is that our public prosecutors, our district attorneys, all too often pass the buck to the NYPD. They all too often blame the lack of an arrest by the NYPD or the bad investigation by the NYPD for their choice not to prosecute drivers.
You know, I'm sorry if you're going to tie up your time and maybe try a case that you may not win. It's not worth your time. That's like telling me my daughter's life isn't worth your time. It's an insult. It's a true insult to every one of us who's lost someone in this city.